Good evening and welcome to KAJ Radio. I'm Joel Gerard, your radio anchor for this evening. On tonight's podcast, KAJ radio journalist Kinda Kadra has industry representative Bethel Ozed Williams on the line, and they will be discussing Bethel's plan for the use of ethylene glycol on our roads as the de-icing agent. Now, over to Kinda.
At the town hall meeting, the industry scientists said that there are two options for manufacturing the ethylene glycol. Who will be involved in the selection process of these methods if the switch to ethylene glycol is to be made?
Correction there are actually three methods that we would consider in the production of ethylene glycol, and each method sort of has its own advantage. So the first one would be the Shell's omega process, and this is a very, very, very efficient method in the sense that you barely have any waste product being formed, and you basically have about twice the amount of ethylene glycol being produced per unit ethylene used. The second process would be the Dow's meteor process, and this is also a very efficient process. You have about 93% conversion, although there is some waste product being formed. However, I'd say the major advantage of this process is that it is a simple one-step process, and so it would be cheaper to establish a plant that would use this method of production. The last process that I feel you guys didn't really consider when you were asking the question is the cellulose process. So using cellulose as a source of ethylene glycol. This is a process that we're doing a lot of research on right now. And initially, we might use less of it just because it's not an established process. But we hope to improve and increase the use of this process because in some ways it is more environmentally friendly in the sense that you have cellulose as a source of ethylene, which is an infinite renewable source of energy, versus crude oil as a source of ethylene. With regards to which or who would decide, how we would decide which of these methods to use, I would say it would be based on our capital, our funding from the government, and essentially the demand of the product. So at the get-go, we would probably use more of the Dow's process just because it's cheaper to establish a plant that uses this method of production. And I mean, the process is 93% efficient, so it's really efficient as well. We would also probably have plants that use the Shell's process, probably not as predominantly, but it's a very efficient process, and so we'd probably have plants that would use this as well. And right now we have research facilities established to research the cellulose process, so we'd keep that going, try to improve on this process and try to use it more as we get more funding or as we get more profit. However, we recognize that there might be some people that might say, you're using more of the Dow's process, this is releasing some waste products into the environment, we don't like this. And so in the sense that that becomes an issue, which probably wouldn't because we're not releasing that much waste product, but in the case that this becomes an issue, we would slowly switch to the Shell's process while we continue to establish the cellulose process.
Community members are concerned about the effects ethylene glycol will have if it is absorbed through the skin. How great is the risk that this will happen, and what are the strategies that will be used to prevent or deal with the effects?
With regards to absorption or toxicity of ethylene glycol based on skin contact, there's very little risk of systemic toxicity based on skin contact because ethylene glycol it's not very well absorbed through the skin. There are two major reasons for that. One of them is because it's a very volatile liquid. And secondly, it doesn't bioaccumulate in tissue. And this is based on research done by the CDC, done across the US and Canada, across the UK as well. So research has shown that there's no bioaccumulation and there's no risk of systemic toxicity. And I guess you could think of it in the sense that ethylene glycol is basically an alcohol. I mean, regardless of how much alcohol you dose yourself or you bathe yourself in, I mean, you probably won't get drunk because there's alcohol in your skin. So there's very little systemic toxicity. I'd say the biggest risk in terms of contact would be, if you got it in your eye. And that's because, the eye is sort of different in that sense, and it would cause a sort of local toxicity. So you'd have some adverse effects in your eye, but you wouldn't get sort of like a spread through your body that would cause a systemic problem. So with regards to skin contact, I'd say there's really little to no issue at all with ethylene glycol.
The bacteria Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which biodegrades ethylene glycol, only grows at 37 degrees Celsius and is an opportunistic pathogen that may be harmful to human and animal health. Is there another method that ethylene glycol will be biodegraded in the environment in order to ensure that it won't bioaccumulate?
I think the when we talk about ethylene glycol being biodegradable in the environment, we forget that the environment has a whole bunch of organisms, you have plants, you have bacteria. So when you say Pseudomonas aeruginosa, it is not the only bacteria that biodegrades ethylene glycol. So like I said, there are plants that could use ethylene glycol as a source of carbon, as a source of nutrition. There are bacteria in the soil. So Pseudomonas aeruginosa is one of them. It's a soil bacteria. Other soil bacteria that also use ethylene glycol are things like Flevobacterium sp, Methanobacterium, Disulfovibrio. So we do have a slew of bacteria that can break down ethylene glycol, and it's not just Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So at temperatures where you might find that, Pseudomonas aeruginosa might not grow, or it might not, do the job of breaking down this chemical, breaking down ethylene glycol, you can always assume that there would be other organisms, other bacteria in that environment that could do the same thing. And you also need to know that, so like I said, Pseudomonas aeruginosa is in the soil. Another thing is that you have most of the ethylene glycol, and this is another question that I feel community members might raise, is that you have the ethylene glycol on the roads. Sure, it can get washed into farmlands and fields and soil, but most of it is being washed up the roads into the sewer system. And the sewer system has its own slew of bacteria as well, including Acetobacter, as well as other strains of Pseudomonas that break down ethylene glycol in sewer sludge. And people might raise the issue of, what if the sewer leaks into the water supply? Frankly, I'd say Gomesville has a good system of regulating the sewer system. Sure, accidents happen, sure, mistakes happen, but it would be up to the government to reinforce these systems of sewer treatment, make sure they're okay, so that regardless of how the bacteria multiplies in the sewer because of this ethylene glycol source of food, the sewer is going to be treated anyways. So the government just has to make sure that they regulate and improve and reinforce that sewer system. Now, in terms of it being an invasive species, it's the same thing I said before. There are other species of bacteria that also consume ethylene glycol. So it's not going to be the sole consumer and explode in so many numbers and cause a lot of problems. I mean, we humans tend to think of the worst case scenario, but you just need to know that there are other bacteria as well that do the same thing. So in that case, I'd say there might, or there wouldn't be, if there is, it probably little problems with not having the right bacteria to biodegrade ethylene glycol.
That's it for us tonight at KAJ Radio. Stay tuned for more videos from KAJ News and podcasts from KAJ Radio. Have a good night, everyone.